all anger is wrong. I'm not saying it is. If you see an injustice being done to someone defenseless, by all means, get angry and step in. But let's be honest, the things that stir our anger are mostly crimes against our pride, our convenience, or our plans for ourselves. Husband always beats me when we play miniature golf. Now, normally, I don't sign up to do things that I know I'm going to lose because I have a kind of competitive nature. But I play golf with my husband to please him. Marriage is about being a partner, right? But I remember playing with him once, and I was bored with losing. So I let my silly side kick in on one hole, and I lofted that golf ball over the hazard. Now, that's not something you're supposed to do. But miraculously, my ball went in, and I got a hole-in-one. In spite of making no serious effort to get a good score on that hole, it paid off for me. My question is, do you think playing with no purpose and no effort is a reliable strategy for getting a good score? In today's Scriptureology lesson, we're going to consider a life lived in such a manner. Last week, we began our study of Samson. God raised him up as a deliverer from his mother's womb, which was different than anything we'd seen before in the judging cycles. Something else that's different about him was the Nazirite vow was put upon him from conception. We learned about the restrictions of that particular kind of vow. You couldn't eat grapes or wine, you couldn't touch a dead body, and you couldn't cut your hair. When we left off last week, Samson had just suffered through a disastrous wedding. Now, the disaster was of his own making because he had recklessly gambled on wedding attendants not being able to solve a riddle. He lost that gamble when his new bride revealed the answer. Samson paid his debt by killing and plundering 30 Philistine men and then stomping back off to his parents' house in a huff. At the end of chapter 14, we learned that the bride's father, surely assuming Samson was done with this woman, he gave his daughter to the best man. Chapter 15 opens some days after these events. We'll see just what happens next. I'm going to be reading Judges chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. After some days at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat, and he said, "I will go into my wife in the chamber." But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, "I really thought you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead." And Samson said to them, "This time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do harm," implying he had not been innocent before. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, "If this is what you will do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit." And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and he went down and he stayed in the cleft of the rock at Edom. Samson goes to visit his bride, and the text is clear that he intends to be intimate with her. So he brings a young goat with him, which is probably a gift intended to communicate something like, "Hey, sorry about all the drama at the wedding, my bad." But he finds out that things have changed, and his wife is now the wife of someone else. Samson probably didn't see that one coming. He had paid the bride price for this woman, and now he was out both money and bride. His former father-in-law tried to pacify him by offering his younger and prettier daughter. But Samson's not having it. His pride has been wounded, and he doesn't stop to consider that his father-in-law's assumption that he would utterly hate the wife who had betrayed him might have some reason to it. Couple that with the fact that the man was willing to make restitution to Samson with another daughter. But Samson does what all of us in our flesh want to do when we are just convinced that we've been wronged. He seeks revenge, but he takes his revenge to a level of diabolical genius. The text says that he went and he caught 300 foxes. Okay, that is no easy task in itself. It would have taken a lot of time because foxes are solitary animals. They don't travel around in packs. For that reason, many scholars think that these animals could have been jackals instead, because jackals do travel in packs. And the Hebrew word is the same for both foxes and jackals, so either translation is good. Regardless of whether Samson caught 300 foxes one at a time or 300 jackals maybe 5 at a time, that was still no little job. He had time to cool his temper and think better of what he was about to do. But he didn't. He fed his anger while he worked. Okay? Some dwarves whistle while they work. Samson apparently fed his anger. And that's consistent with his earlier behavior when he hiked 40 miles to kill Philistines to settle his gambling debt. He had time to cool down and use his head too. But he didn't. What about you? Do you manage and control your anger, or are you driven by it? Now, as long as we live in a sinful world and we have a brainwave, there are going to be people and situations that just make us angry. The sweetest, meekest Christian women I know, my own daughter Priscilla, for his example, she gets angry. So what are we to do when that happens? I'll tell you first what we don't do. We don't play the victim of our emotions and act like we are just helpless to rule them with excuses like, well, I can't help how I feel. Says who? Our feelings are indicators. They're not determiners. So we do what Samson failed to do. We take the time to think about the situation. We try to see every side of it, not just our own. And then we make a right judgment about it. And remember, not all anger is wrong. I'm not saying it is. If you see an injustice being done to someone defenseless, by all means, get angry and step in. But let's be honest, the things that stir our anger are mostly crimes against our pride, our convenience, or our plans for ourselves. This is the counsel of Scripture about those situations. Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. Proverbs 19:11. The more you can let go of offenses done to yourself, the more fruit of the Spirit you exhibit in your life, the more you glorify Christ with your resemblance to him. Now, the world says if you let people get by with offenses, then you're training them to act that way. You're an enabler of bad behavior. There's even a supposedly Christian book that advocates this pragmatic position for followers of Christ. I think the folks who wrote it would probably tell Jesus to his face that he was wrong in exhorting his disciples to turn the other cheek. But Jesus never said that discipleship was easy, and he watched most of those who began to follow him just walk away. Turning the other cheek and overlooking offenses are things the world has no motivation to do. Why would they? There's just nothing in it for them. And that's why authentic disciples stand out for doing it. The only thing that's in it for us is the pleasure of obedience to God. The world can't believe that that's enough to simply be satisfied with God. But it is, or it should be. As one of my favorite authors, Pastor and theologian John Piper writes, God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. Now, even though Samson was God's appointed deliverer, there's nothing in the text that indicates Samson was in any way satisfied with God. He tied the tails of those foxes together in pairs, lit them up, and set them loose. And that is just cruel. Reminds me of something a troubled teenage boy would think up. Of course, those foxes ran like their tails were on fire, and they set the Philistines' grain fields ablaze. That was a big deal to the Philistines, to lose their crop. Okay, it's not like they could just run to the Piggly Wiggly for bread when they ran out. Their problem is they can't take their revenge on Samson because he is long gone. So they do what they can do, and they burn the woman who used to be Samson's wife and her daddy. Now that's exactly what they had threatened to do to her if she didn't get the answer to the wedding riddle for them. See, in the long run, betraying her husband didn't help her. She still ended up burned. Well, you know what happens when Samson thinks he's been wronged. He's got to avenge himself. The text isn't specific about how he does this. It just says he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow. And that appears to be some kind of Hebrew idiom, the meaning of which isn't precise to us. But we know it wasn't good for the Philistines. Now, at the beginning of Samson's story in this judging cycle, we noted that unlike all the judging cycles that had come before, there was a notable absence of the Israelites crying out to God for deliverance from their oppression. Apparently, they had just gotten used to it. And the degree to which they had accepted it becomes apparent in the latter verses of chapter 15. The Philistines know that Samson is living somewhere in Judah, and so they prepare to attack the Jews living in the area. So what do the Jews do when they learn about this? They hand over Samson to the Philistines, or at least they try to. They don't muster men to fight the Philistines. They muster men to fight their own God-appointed deliverer. That's a new low point for Israel. Well, Samson tells the Jews who have come for him that he will allow himself to be bound if they promise not to attack him themselves, which they promise. So this may be the first selfless thing that we see Samson do. If he hadn't let the men of Judah hand him over, the Philistines could have easily wiped them out. The Israelites just didn't have conventional weapons. But as Samson is being handed over, verse 14 says, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and his bonds melted off his hands. And then he picks up a fresh jawbone of a donkey and uses it to kill 1,000 men. Okay, presumably those are Philistine men. I tell you what, in our study of Judges, we have seen some improvised weapons, haven't we? An ox goad, a tent peg, a millstone, and now the jawbone of a donkey. Pretty much anything at hand is fair in war, I guess. Chapter 15 concludes with an amazing scene of grace. After Samson throws down the jawbone, he comes to the realization that he's very thirsty. And he does something we have not seen him do before. He prays. He acknowledges that God is responsible for his victory. Okay, that's a positive start to the prayer. But then he basically follows it up with, and now I am to die of thirst and be captured? Well, I guess if he literally died of thirst, it wouldn't matter if he'd been captured, but he's being dramatic. What's astonishing is that God miraculously provides water by splitting open a hollow place nearby. See, Samson didn't get that miracle because he named it and claimed it. He got grace because God still had a job for him to do. And we'll get to that right after this brief break. I'm excited to tell you about the new book study we'll be doing after the first of the year. It's the book of Romans. It was studying the book of Romans that persuaded an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther in the year 1515 that people are justified by faith alone in Jesus Christ. And the rediscovery and preaching of this revelation in God's Word lit the fires of Reformation in the church. Romans is arguably the most theologically rich book of the Bible. It highlights the righteousness of God, and it's my prayer our study of it will light Reformation fires in our hearts. I covet your prayers as I prepare our lessons and ask that you make plans to join me for a life-changing study of the book of Romans. Invite a friend to watch with you. As chapter 16 opens, we find our man Samson in Gaza at the house of a prostitute. Okay, this is the man who was just praying to God 3 verses earlier. Well, the men of Gaza find out that Samson is in their city, and they make plans to kill him first thing in the morning. Okay, but Samson isn't there to build a relationship with the prostitute that he's visiting. He leaves at midnight, and he takes the gates of the city with him. The text says that he carries these gates to the top of the hill in front of Hebron. Let's take a look at the map. Samson started in Gaza, which is marked with a yellow star. He carries these heavy iron gates to Hebron, marked with a red star. That's a distance of 40 miles. And do you notice the topography on the map? It's uphill all the way. Now, by removing a city's gates, you prove how utterly defenseless that city is. And more than that, the gates represented the city's seat of authority. That's where business was transacted. To take a city's gates was an act intended to humiliate the city leaders. Verse 4 of chapter 16 begins one of the most famous stories in all the Bible. If you were in Sunday school as a child, you heard the story of Samson and Delilah. The text says Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek. Now, we don't know the name of Samson's mother. We don't know the name of Samson's wife. We don't know the name of the prostitute in Gaza. But we know the name of the last woman who played a role in his life, Delilah. Somehow word got out that Samson had it bad for this woman. And one day she's paid a visit by the lords of the Philistines. This phrase, lords of the Philistines, was a technical political title that connected the 5 large Philistine cities on the southern coastal plain. These 5 leaders offered Delilah 1,100 shekels of silver each to collude with them in learning the secret of Samson's strength so that he could be captured. 2 things we should note about their offer. First is, 5,500 shekels doesn't really have an impact on us, but it was a boatload of money. It would be equal to 550 years of the average annual wage. Okay, to put that in modern terms, according to the Social Security Administration, the average annual wage in the United States currently is $41,673. So the net present value of Delilah's offer would have been almost $23 million. No wonder she was so motivated to find out his secret. Okay, Samson was just a boyfriend. With $23 million in her purse, Delilah could probably find another one. And the second thing about the offer of money to discover the source of Samson's strength is that it indicates that aside from his long hair, which the Philistines probably knew was associated with some religious vow of the Jews, but aside from that, Samson likely didn't look any different from other men. If he had like these crazy 40-inch biceps, the Philistines wouldn't have been mystified. They'd be like, okay, the dude's a walking gun show. But Samson didn't have an obvious source of his strength. It's Delilah's job to find out what it is. So she begs and she pleads with Samson to tell her the secret. Now, you'd think that Samson would have learned his lesson about giving away his secrets to women with all the drama that happened when his wife told the secret of his riddle back at that wedding disaster. You'd think that he would have learned to just say no. But he didn't. Instead, he toys with her. He gives her clues, and he gets closer and closer to the truth each time, until finally the text says, his soul was vexed to death. And he tells her if his head were to be shaved, he'd be weak like any other man. It's amazing if you think about it. Samson could carry heavy iron gates uphill for 40 miles, but he couldn't stand up to a woman's persistence. Now, listen as I read the climax of the story and the climax of Samson's life. I'm going to be reading Judges chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. She made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. And she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country who has killed many of us. And when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson, that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars. And Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, and his right hand on one and his left on the other. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed in his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him up and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years. Samson's power was never in his hair. As verse 20 indicates, it's more significant that the Lord left him than that his hair left him. It was God who gave Samson the strength to do all that he had done. But now his hair is gone, and perhaps the last bit of his Nazirite vow that remained intact. Remember, he had been surrounded by grapes in the vineyards, and that he had touched a dead carcass of a lion. And when his hair was gone, so was God's presence with him. The Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and hauled him back to Gaza to grind flour in a mill. That was humiliating work for a free man. Grinding flour was normally done by slaves or women or donkeys. I'm sure the Philistines could have paid some mercenary a lot less than they paid Delilah just to kill Samson outright. But they didn't want him dead. They wanted him humiliated. There wasn't any Geneva Convention in those days that regulated the treatment of prisoners. They could do whatever they wanted to Samson. And one day they interrupted Samson's grinding routine to have him appear at a public festival in the temple of their god Dagon, whom the Philistines gave credit and praise to for helping capture their enemy. We're told there were 3,000 Philistine men and women partying on the roof, which gave them a view of the temple court below. That's where Samson was brought in. But the young man who led him in, he granted Samson a strategic request. He placed Samson between the main supporting columns of the temple. And then Samson prayed. Now, before we point out the problem with Samson's prayer, let's point out the positive. The fact that he prayed at all was a good sign. It showed that Samson acknowledges dependence on God. This is Samson's second recorded prayer. The first was at the end of chapter 15 when he asked God if he was going to allow him to die of thirst after he had killed 1,000 Philistines. Both prayers are offered when Samson is vulnerable and has nowhere else to turn. Then he remembers God. That's a lot like us, isn't it? But at least Samson remembers God. And there's a second positive thing about Samson's prayer. It's that it comes after he asked the young man to guide him to the supporting pillars. That indicates that Samson had faith that God would answer his prayer before he prayed it. And perhaps that's why Samson's name is included in the list of faith-filled judges recorded in Hebrews 11. Because other than the order of his positioning in his prayer, it's hard to see where Samson's faith was manifested. The words of the prayer itself seem selfish. Samson asks God to avenge his eyes. He's not asking for deliverance for the nation of Israel, the people that he was supposed to be acting on behalf of. Now God sovereignly grants Samson's request for personal vengeance to kill all the Philistines at the festival, because that's what Samson was supposed to be doing anyway, killing Philistines. It's an amazing demonstration of God's ability to work through his appointed ministers, even when their motives are impure and selfish. God's work isn't hindered by anything, but what a contrast Samson is as a deliverer next to Jesus. Samson was motivated by revenge to commit suicide after a life of selfish indulgences, but Jesus was motivated to lay down his life for his murderous enemies after living a life of self-denial. Samson demonstrated brute physical strength, and Jesus demonstrated tender meekness and unquenchable inner spiritual strength. Samson thought of himself in his last hour, but Jesus thought of others in his last hour.
This program is viewer-supported. If you appreciate in-depth Bible study on television, please consider supporting our ministry with a gift. You can contribute online at Scriptureology.com or at the address on your screen.